Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest book review for Classroom Hacks. And today we have a very special review. As I said in the previous review that we had with Norse mythology, this upcoming review, I do believe, at least in my honest opinion, is the front runner for review of the year, as this book has been incredible. It has been very eye-opening and enlightening and inspiring in many ways, and that is Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. But as always, before we get into that, just want to say that we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation, with your educational liaisons, where you can seriously learn to take teaching not so seriously. This is and we are Classroom Hack. Yes, we are here today to review Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. I know it might sound like the title of a 90s boy band love song, but I assure you that it is not. It is actually the title of a really well-rounded, deeply researched, illuminating, wonderful, incredibly fascinating, just overall fantastic read. I am really excited to sort of get a deep dive into this one, as I believe Brene Brown has really brought to light some incredible ways to sort of look at emotions and unearth a lot of the things that we are familiar with and allow them for us to see them in a brand new light. And so, as always, before we get into our discussion of that, here is a summary of Atlas of the Heart. This comes directly from Brene Brown's website at brenebrown.com. And she writes, Atlas of the Heart is designed for mapping meaningful connection and the language of human experience. If we want to find the way back to ourselves and one another, we need language and the grounded confidence to both tell our stories and to be stewards of the stories that we hear. In Atlas of the Heart, we explore 87 of the emotions and experiences that define what it means to be human and walk through a new framework for cultivating meaningful connection. This is for the map makers and travelers in all of us. And in the book, she does allude to map making and how sort of our emotions and who we are as individuals can be sort of paralleled to the idea of a map. There are layers with it, but there's significance to those layers, which she does go on to talk about in the book. And for those of you listening, I did listen to the Audible book, and Brown does narrate it, and it's a great listen, primarily because not only do you get sort of a sense of her personality, but there's plenty of times where she will really pause on certain things, reiterate certain things, reflect on certain things, and it does add a bit more emphasis to those particular areas. And when I was first listening to this, I was sort of questioning 87 emotions. That's more emotions that I could really think of off the top of my head, and why it's important to sort of identify and address and analyze and explore these emotions is, as Brown sort of suggests at the very beginning of the book, she presents a quote from Wittgenstein, who says, "The limits of my language means the limits of my world." And she addresses why this is so powerful. And one of the things that we sort of look at, and as an English instructor, one thing that I can definitely agree with and get on board with is that language, critical thinking, the way we can not only see the world but explain it, is only going to be as vast as our vocabulary and as our explanations sort of take us. And in the world of emotions, when you have less of an understanding or less of a vocabulary or less of a means to translate what you are feeling, you are definitely going to be limited in getting some of these ideas across, which was essentially seemingly so elementary, but at the same time incredibly groundbreaking. As I think about many of the times that I've had conversations with my wife, arguments, disputes, and many times where I've wished I had better tools, better means of articulation, a better way to express how I feel. And Brown sort of goes through these emotions and really breaks them down and allows you to sort of reconsider many of the ways that you might have been feeling at different times in your life, and then sort of re-examining them and questioning, was I really feeling anger at this time, or was it more disappointment? Was I really feeling grief, Or was I feeling something else? Was I really feeling happiness, or was this really joy or contentment? And so she kind of goes through all these, and it's such a wonderful sort of journey that she takes you on. And so I listened to this book on many of my drives to work, and I will say that there have been plenty of times where I just had to stop and just only listen to that. There were plenty of times where I had to re-listen to certain things because I wanted to capture many of the quotes and many of the great sort of pieces of insight and wisdom that Brown provides, so I could write them down and have them here for this review. And so instead of just doing a general sort of synopsis, I'm going to kind of do that, but also go through some of the key emotions that really sort of hit home with me and sort of really stuck out to me, especially because I think she sort of illuminates these in such a way, for me especially, that they were highly impactful and even very revolutionary just in the way that I see things and the way that my perspective is sort of shaped. So before I do that, again, just to kind of add to the synopsis, like I said, Brown sort of breaks this up into several different sections, how she groups different emotions together. And so she kind of frames it in the way of like, where do, the places we go when we're feeling this, or the places we go when we feel a certain way. And so I'm actually just going to sort of bring up the chapters in the book so you can kind of at least get an idea of what I'm referring to here with some of this stuff. And so in some of these chapters, like chapter 1, places we go when things are uncertain. Chapter 2, places we go when we compare. Chapter 3, places we go when things don't go as planned. And so we have 13 different chapters, and essentially, as Brown is going through all these different emotions and kind of grouping them in these different sections, we get to the end of the piece, and it's sort of a build-up to this sort of takeaway or dissertation or analysis that she's really trying to break down. And that kind of breaks down to how do we really create meaningful connections with one another. And in the light of everything that's gone on, not just with the pandemic, but the previous election, that we sort of see this divided and divisive nation that we're sort of living in, the sort of tribalism that people talk about, and the way that even amongst our own family, there is distance or detachment. And so one of the goals of this book was to allow us to sort of recreate some of those connections. And the way Brown sort of says it is that we do that by understanding each other's emotions, by understanding our emotions, taking accountability for the things we can, but also trying to understand where different people come from. And so as we move along with some of this, like I said, I'm just going to really sort of talk about some of the areas that really stuck out to me the most. So the first one that really sort of hit a chord with me was when Brown talks about disappointment and managing our realities and expressing our expectations. Now, this was huge, primarily because she not only uses examples with her and her husband, like at the time they went to Disney World, and she thought she was going to read all these books, and then her husband just sort of said, are you really managing your realities here? And I think about those similar things with me and my family, where we would like to get all these things done, but then when we don't, we become disappointed or we become angry with our partner or anyone else because we didn't manage our own realities, and instead we take blame with other people. And so she kind of addresses this little hack that suggests that partners need to keep each other's realities in check by simply verbalizing what the other needs or could use and being open to listening to those needs. It's easy to expect to get things done, but it's also easy to get upset with one another when they don't. If we can express our expectations to one another, it's no longer a guessing game, and we should be able to help our partners get to the things they feel are important while also managing ourselves and the goals around us. And when I heard that, I was like, wow, that is so insightful, primarily because I've been there myself, where I have put blame on my partner or other people, where I thought that they didn't do something that I thought was expected, when I really just never communicated to that to them, or we just didn't have an understanding of our realities and how we need to manage them. And so going forward, I now have a better way to sort of address those needs, especially ahead of time, and that we can both be on the same page and not make the same errors and then get upset with each other with them. The next concept that she goes on to talk about is disappointment. Disappointment is out of our control. Regret is due to our own actions. To live without regrets means to live without reflection. And I thought this was huge, and because one of the things that we often try to do is we either say, yeah, you know what, don't regret what you do because you did it and that's the reason you do it. But as Brown sort of points out, regret is incredibly beneficial because regret means that we take time to go inward and think about what we did, why we did it, and if we hurt someone in the process, if we need to try to change what we do, if we need to learn from that in any way. So to be able to live with regret means to be able to go back and sort of understand why we did what we did to become the person that we are, and can we change that? Desirable difficulty. The brain needs to feel some discomfort when it's learning. Now, as an educator, that simple sort of philosophy is huge. And that's something that I like to try to incorporate in my classes. I like to have the idea of college being, if you don't know, I am a college instructor, and I like to try to have college still be an experience. I go by the camp of experiential learning, which I think is the most powerful type of learning. But this desirable difficulty, as sort of Brown addresses here, building up our intelligence and our curiosity and our understanding is like building muscle. That there has to be some sort of restraint, there has to be some sort of push, there has to be some sort of difficulty in order to develop the way we think, the way we see things, the way we understand things. And the more difficulty that we have when it comes to problem solving, the better problem solvers we become. And so this was incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful, especially something so simple that can be implemented in our classrooms. She then goes on to talk about nostalgia. Nostalgia is an interesting one, as she observes it as a double-edged sword, that people can be nostalgic for home or for the way things are, or the way things were, my apologies, which has underlying meaning. The discussion about cognitive dissonance was interesting as it's reflective of current times when people are so steadfast to a belief that they double down even when proven wrong and do mental gymnastics to make two conflicting ideas work. This is probably the best explanation that I've heard of cognitive dissonance. Paradox was interesting as well, as she describes two opposite ideas that are intertwined, like how there can be no light without dark and vice versa. And so the reason I bring this section up is because we sometimes will mince words, or we'll think one thing means another and apply it in a scenario when it's not necessarily accurate. And so sometimes we create synonymous ideas with certain concepts that aren't necessarily true. And when we do that, we then sort of frame a reality around this particular emotion that might not be entirely accurate. And that's huge, especially when we go back and we reflect on certain things and we said, oh, this is how I was feeling at that time. But then when we have a new way to look at it and say, well, was I really feeling this? And if I wasn't feeling this, then perhaps I acted in a certain way that wasn't concurrent or in correlation with what I was truly feeling. And then that could make you see the scene of your life in a whole new way. She goes on to quote, the builders of greatness are comfortable with paradox. They don't oppress themselves with what we call the tyranny of the or, which pushes people to believe things must be A or B, but not both. Instead, they liberate themselves with the genius of the and. Rejecting paradox can result in conflict and turmoil. And this, again, as an educator, was a huge sort of concept to sort of take in, that it must either be this or it must be this. But when you are developing something, well, why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't it be both? And so as we bring some of these lessons to our classes, when students think there's only one path, especially in my class when I have them do different types of projects, I sometimes have students who just want to be told, tell me exactly what you want me to write, and I'll go and build a project around it. But I like to give them more liberation because I want them to see if they can still deliver a cogent argument or cogent analysis or evaluation or narrative through the lens of an essay or through the lens of a podcast or through the lens of a video or a PowerPoint or a website. These different mechanisms and different sorts of dynamics that they can tinker with and put together gets their brain to work in a variety of different ways and shows them it's not just A or B, but it can be a combination of these things. Brown then talks about irony, sarcasm, and anguish. She points out that irony is the umbrella term, while sarcasm is within it. To truly understand how to apply sarcasm, we have to be able to infer what another person is thinking and feeling. This can also be said about understanding as well. Her section on anguish nearly brought me to tears when she was talking about the young girl who lost her mother before her quinceañera. Like I said, Brown, orating her own book, really is invested and passionate, obviously, about her work, and that obviously comes through in some of these anecdotal and stories and research-based ideas that she discusses. Brown discusses shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Shame was a longer section since it was broken down into different types of shame. This section made me realize that the shame assignment that I do in my class is I actually labeled it incorrectly. It shouldn't be titled shame. It should be more closely related to guilt. So I do a section on fat shaming and how shame can sometimes be used as a tool, as they refer to as productive or toxic shaming. But after listening to this section, I realized that maybe it's not shame that we're talking about, but guilt, when we try to get people to do something differently or get them to change. As with shame, the concept of belonging was one that really stood out to me. This was a longer section, but it was very, very in-depth and very, very eye-opening. Brown addresses the differences between belonging and fitting in, and reads through observations made by 8th graders she posed the question to about what is the difference in your eyes between belonging and fitting in. And one of the observations that stuck out was belonging is when I get to be me, fitting in is when I have to be like you. And that was something that she sort of applies to her own family. And she says that in our home, I want my kids to know that they will always belong. And having a son and growing our family and hoping to add more children with another one on the way, it's one of those things where it's like, you don't ever want your kids to feel like they have to try to fit in their own house, that they're not welcome in their own home. And so the idea of belonging is something that as humans we strive for, and there's no deeper connection than that. And so for my kids and my family and my wife, I don't ever want them to feel like they don't belong. This is where they belong, and that's something that we want to try to instill in the lives we create. In other chapters, Brown discusses flooding, hurt, joy, happiness, and calm. She discusses how we all have individual capacities for flooding and have to learn how to express the difference between feeling hurt and hurt feelings. So, for example, when someone that we love dies, we often say, I'm hurting, not your death hurt my feelings. Hurt feelings refer to a variety of feelings one is experiencing during a point of conflict or confrontation. She goes on to talk about gratitude, which was a big one for me as well. She, just to sort of paraphrase here, gratitude makes us appreciate the value of something, and when we appreciate the value of something, we extract more benefits from it. We're less likely to take it for granted. Gratitude allows us to participate more in life. We notice the positives more, and that magnifies the pleasures you get from life. She then talks about tranquility, anger, and contempt. Anger and contempt were fascinating to hear about, especially as she put some unique observations to the concepts. She talks about anger in the sense that it is an emotional indicator. Anger is like your check engine light coming on to tell you to slow down and check your car. Brown feels anger is oftentimes used to describe or mask other emotions we might be feeling but not able to articulate in the moment. So, for example, we might say, I'm so angry at myself, when we really mean to say, I'm so disappointed in my performance. So, as we look back and reflect on some of these emotions, we might think that we were pissed off or angry about something when in fact we might have been let down or disappointed overall. She then talks about contempt, which was fascinating, as she described a study of thousands of married couples that showed a 90% divorce rate when contempt was highly visible. Brown described contempt as a noxious brew of anger and disgust, and not just that, the contempt of other people's ideas, but for other people. She primarily connects this to the concept motive attribution asymmetry, which is the belief that when two sides are at conflict, one side believes that they are working out of love or justice, while the other is coming from a place of hate or evil. And just applying some of these concepts and thinking to our current culture and our current society, how one of the reasons why this division appears to be widening is because each side thinks that they are doing the right thing, or they are coming from the side of good, and that the other side must be inextricably evil if that's going to be the case. If we're the good guys, then they're obviously the bad guys. But this idea and concept of motive attribution asymmetry is really fascinating, and something that is probably at the core of a lot of this divisiveness and tribalism as well. Cultivating meaningful connection. And to sort of break down the three pillars of this idea, she establishes that the first is to create and cultivate meaningful connection is to, one, establish grounded confidence, which is focused on learning and improving. Two, practicing the courage to walk alongside others, so to walk alongside someone else. And story stewardship. How do we know what other people are feeling? We ask them, we listen, and we become trusted stewards of their story, honoring the stories we share and hear. Something valuable we treat with respect and care. And she sort of leaves with this final thought in regards to the only way to the other side of struggle is through it. And I think that was a nice way to sort of end the book. That's not essentially the ending, but it's one of the last things and concepts that she leaves with. It is this idea that we all feel different emotions at different times. But the only way that we can get through those, or to the other side of it, is we have to go through it. We have to work through them. We have to understand them. We have to get the tools that we need in order to get over them. And as I finished Atlas of the Heart, like I said, this was really an illuminating, a wonderful, a really inspiring book. And it is the front runner. And I have read and listened to some quality pieces so far, but this was just something that I knew that after I listened to it, I'm like, I'm going to listen to this again, because there's so many different concepts, and obviously 87 emotions is a lot. And so I didn't really get to really take in all of them at 100% capacity. Obviously, I wrote down the ones that really sort of impacted me in the moment, but this is one that I'll be listening to 3 or 4 times easily, and probably even more for the rest of my life. And so I found myself really appreciating the perspective and taking familiar ideas and being able to view them in a new light. It shows that discovery doesn't have to be entirely new, that revisiting pre-existing ideas can show us that we can have that we can unlearn and learn new perspectives even from old ideas. This gives me hope for the world. It means that nothing is permanent and there is always room for growth, change, and interpretation. Overall score, 5 out of 5. The primary critique that myself or people might have is that Brown does insert some political takes that didn't really bother me. But some people might, because of the way that they think, oh, I hear this particular take, she's going progressive or liberal or has a particular agenda. But I think she does a good and honest job of being objective in that way, giving the research, really deep diving into these emotions and unearthing these different concepts in a way that is new and novel and allows us to try to become better people, not just in the way we see things for ourselves, but in the way we see others. For next time, we are going to be covering another fantastic read, and that is Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights.
Get in with us, but that's all right. We'll worry about that later.
Well, all right. Now, that was a fun adventure, especially coming off this book with Brene Brown. Very eye-opening, enlightening. I wanted something that could still be sort of educational and inspiring, but also a good time. And so that's Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights, and that's on the next book review for Classroom Hacks. Again, until next time, fellow hacks, I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it gave you some insight into Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart and gets you to pick it up. I highly recommend it. And as always, I hope this helps in your classes and just helps helps you as you continue to be a lifelong learner. So until next time, fellow hacks, have a good one.